The judge said, "I don't want uniforms in my courtroom," until the defendant read Article 88 of the Military Code of Justice. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to remind them what the law used to mean. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The courtroom was as quiet as a church when the bailiff called the next case. Civil trespassing, land use violation, nothing out of the ordinary on the beer docket. But what walked into the room next made everyone shift in their seats. The defendant wasn't a man in a cheap suit with a smug lawyer. He was in full military dress uniform, decorated, pressed, and precise. His posture was upright but not showy. He wore no expression, no smile, no scowl. Just calm authority, the kind you don't learn in school. Colonel Vincent Hale, retired. But you'd never guess he was retired. The row of ribbons on his chest told stories of foreign deserts and icy mountains, of orders followed and friends buried. And though he hadn't worn that uniform in a courtroom before, today was not a day for compromise. The judge, Honorable Louis B. Harding, was known for his rigidity, rules above emotion, efficiency above empathy, and above all else, he hated being surprised. So when he looked up from the bench and saw the uniform, his face tightened. "This is a courtroom, not a parade ground," Judge Harding snapped. "Sir, I suggest you remove that uniform jacket if you wish to be heard today." Colonel Hale said nothing at first. He stepped forward, boots echoing like warnings, and placed a worn leather folder on the desk in front of him. Then, calmly, and without breaking eye contact, he opened it. "I stand before this court under oath, Your Honor," he said, voice low but resonant, "and I respectfully decline your request." The judge bristled. "Decline? On what grounds?" The colonel turned, a page in the folder. "On the grounds of Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and by the precedents of the Civil Military Relations Act of 1962, which this very state ratified." People began murmuring. A young woman near the back pulled out her phone, not to record, just to check that this man was who she thought he was. "Article 88, Colonel Hale continued, states that contemptuous words against certain officials by commissioned officers are forbidden, but more importantly, it recognizes the reciprocal obligation, respect shown to those who've served. This courtroom, sir, may not be subject to parade rules, but it is subject to precedent, and precedent respects uniformed testimony." The judge's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "You're standing in front of a man who once defended a courtroom with sandbags and a rifle, not gavels and threats," Hale added. "If that history is too loud for your chamber, I'll gladly stand outside and speak to the people who still listen." The bailiff looked nervously at the judge. One of the clerks stopped typing. Even the plaintiff's lawyer, a local business magnate accusing Hale of trespassing on federal surveyed land, sat a little straighter. Then something unexpected happened. A young man seated in the audience stood up quietly. He was in civilian clothes, but on his wrist was a faded green band, a deployment bracelet. He raised his hand and said, "Permission to remain standing, sir?" Colonel Hale gave a slight. George, the courtroom was shifting, not in chaos, in gravity. Judge Harding cleared his throat. "This court recognizes your service, Colonel," he said stiffly. "But this case is about land, not uniforms." "That's where you're wrong, Your Honor," Hale replied. "It's always about what the land means and who paid for it." Silence. The courtroom had just become a battlefield, not of noise but of meaning, and no one, not even the judge, would walk away unchanged. The judge shifted in his seat, clearly rattled. Colonel Vincent Hale stood motionless, the folder still open before him, displaying faded documents clipped with rusting paper fasteners. They weren't flashy. They were old, government-issued, and stamped with the kind of seals you only see when history decides to whisper. "I'm not here to argue land rights," Hale continued, his voice even. "I'm here because that piece of land holds something far more permanent than property lines." "Colonel Hale," the judge said, trying to regain control, "I must remind you again, this court deals with facts, not sentimentality. The Issue here is a fence placed 5 feet beyond a legal boundary. The colonel slowly closed the folder. That fence, he replied, wasn't built by accident. It was built to preserve a marker. A marker? The plaintiff's lawyer interjected a little too quickly. There's no official marker on that plot, Colonel. We had the area scanned. It's clear. No monuments, no graves. Not all graves are marked with stone, Hale said, his voice low now. Some are marked with memory. There was a pause, the kind that wrapped around the room like smoke. My platoon bivouacked on that land for 2 nights during winter survival training, January 1982. We lost a man the second night to exposure. We buried him until medevac could arrive 3 days. Later, he didn't make it back whole. That trench was never filled properly, so we marked it, wood, then iron, then steel. The fence wasn't for security. It was a promise. A woman in the audience let out an audible breath. The judge looked down at his notes, unsure whether to respond to military history or suppress it. I checked every public record, the lawyer said, quieter now. There's no record of a death there. Colonel Hale turned toward him. You're right, it was never filed. The Army didn't document non-combat training fatalities until '86. We were told to move on. And the land belongs to Mr. Renshaw now, the lawyer countered, gesturing to the plaintiff, a man in his early 50s, clean-cut and clearly annoyed. Then maybe Mr. Renshaw would like to explain, Hale said, eyes narrowing, why that fence has never been touched until now. Renshaw stood up, annoyed. Because I didn't know it mattered. It's an old fence on unused land. I'm building a warehouse. I didn't come here to debate ghosts. That word, ghosts, hung in the air like a slap. Colonel Hale didn't flinch. His name was Private First Class Jeremy Thorne. He was 19, from Decatur, Illinois. He volunteered. Froze to death under my command because I misjudged the wind factor. You want to build over that? Be my guest. But don't pretend you didn't know. The judge's gavel hit the bench, not hard, just loud enough to refocus the room. We'll recess for 15 minutes, he announced. This court will consider the relevance of these claims. But the room didn't move. Not for a while. As people began to shuffle, a veteran in the second row stood, walked to the front, and placed a small folded flag on the clerk's desk. He said nothing. Then walked out. Colonel Hale remained still, eyes forward, and for the first time that day, Judge Harding did not look away. 15 minutes felt longer than it should have. The courtroom had emptied halfway, yet the weight of what had just been said remained, clinging to the air like humidity before a storm. Colonel Vincent Hale hadn't moved from his spot near the witness stand. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture ramrod straight, too straight for a man his age. The folded flag still sat on the clerk's desk, untouched. No one dared move it. When the judge returned, something about him looked different. Not shaken, but aware. I've reviewed the material submitted by Colonel Hale. Judge Harding began, his voice carefully neutral. While this court does not traditionally accept unsworn testimony during civil disputes, I am granting temporary leave to hear the colonel's account, for the sake of clarity. Whispers fluttered across the gallery like birds startled from a wire. Colonel, the judge continued, you may proceed. Briefly. Hale didn't nod. He simply opened the folder again, revealing a weathered map, its edges curled and yellowing. This is a topographical layout from 1982, he said, unclassified. My unit camped here. He pointed to a ridge outlined in red ink. There were 4 firewatch rotations. On the second night, PFC Jeremy Thorne failed to return from his patrol. We searched for 6 hours before we found him. He looked up, eyes steady. He was curled into himself like a child. Frostbite had set in too far. He was still alive when we found him. Barely. No one in the room made a sound. I made a decision. We didn't have the means to get him out, in time. So we kept him warm, fed him IV glucose, and waited. He died the next morning. He turned the page to a grainy photo, black and white, time-stamped. It showed a crude wooden cross planted in packed snow. No name, just coordinates scribbled. In pencil. We buried him temporarily. I ordered the cross made from ration crates. When medevac finally arrived, we took what we could, but the ground was never closed properly. The opposing lawyer stood, visibly conflicted. Your Honor, with all due respect, this still doesn't establish legal precedent over Mr. Renshaw's development rights. Hale's head turned slowly toward him. Then tell me what to do with this, he said, pulling something from his jacket pocket, a small envelope, brittle and torn at the edges. His mother mailed this to me in 1983. I never opened it. He held it up. She sent it after the Army returned his body. She thanked me for bringing her son home. He placed the envelope on the stand. But the truth is, I didn't. Not all of him. The judge looked pale. Mr. Renshaw for the first time sat forward. His eyes weren't angry now, just troubled. I didn't know, he muttered. Nobody told me what happened there. Colonel Hale nodded once. And that's the problem. We keep burying things we're too afraid to remember, until we build over them. Judge Harding cleared his throat. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning to review new evidence. Until then, construction on the disputed property is hereby halted. Gavel down. Session adjourned. As people stood to leave, a boy, maybe 12 years old, walked up to the folded flag. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it, and then turned to his father and whispered, "Was that man a hero?" The father didn't answer right away. He just said, "Let's go home." The sun had begun to set by the time Colonel Hale stepped out of the courthouse. The air smelled of concrete dust and summer grass, two things that didn't belong together, yet somehow always did in places like this. He didn't look at the crowd outside, didn't speak to the reporters who swarmed with recorders outstretched like weapons. He simply kept walking, slow and steady, his left knee favoring him with each step. Inside the courthouse, the judge sat alone in his chambers. The file folder still lay open on his desk. Beside it, the envelope from 1983, unopened, just like the story had remained all these years. Judge Harding had spent most of his career separating emotion from fact. But that envelope, it gnawed at the boundary. He picked it up, weighed it, in his hand like it might crumble under pressure. Across town, at a local diner dimly lit with neon flicker, Colonel Hale sat in a corner booth. His coat hung over the seat and a black coffee cooled in front of him. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a ponytail and tired eyes, recognized him immediately. She said nothing, just topped off his cup and left a slice of pie beside it. No check. Hale didn't eat. He just stared at the pie like it reminded him of something long gone. A man entered, clearly younger, corporate shirt still tucked tight into his slacks, Mr. Renshaw. He didn't belong in that kind of place, but he walked to Hale's booth anyway. Mind if I sit? Hale didn't move. It's a free country. Renshaw sat awkwardly. He didn't order anything. I went back to the site, he said quietly. After court. Looked around. It's just dirt, weeds. Doesn't even look like anything ever happened. There. It didn't, Hale replied. Not anymore, but it used to. Renshaw hesitated. I didn't know. That's the trouble with history, Hale muttered. People think if you don't teach it, it disappears. Renshaw nodded, ashamed. I wasn't trying to disrespect anything. I just saw land on paper, blueprints, permits, not a grave. Hale finally looked at him. You saw profit. That's not a crime. But it can blind you. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Hale reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, an old dog tag, scratched and dull. This belonged to Thorne. I found it 3 days after the body. Was flown home. Buried under the snow. He must have lost it the night he collapsed. Renshaw stared at it. I could have mailed it to the family, Hale continued. But I didn't. I kept it. Like if I held on to it, maybe the part of him left behind wouldn't vanish. He set the tag on the table. It made a faint clink against the porcelain plate beneath the untouched pie. I'm going to return it now. Renshaw swallowed. You still talk to his family? No, Hale said. But I know where they live. Back at the courthouse, Judge Harding stood by the window holding the envelope. He opened it slowly, hands trembling more than he expected. Inside, a short letter in careful cursive. Dear Colonel Hale, I don't know what to say, except thank you. I know bringing my boy home couldn't have been easy. I know it hurt. I can feel it in your silence. Jeremy always wrote about you, said you were quiet but fierce, said you never left a man behind. I guess you didn't. With gratitude and sorrow, Margaret Thorne. The judge sat back, letter in hand, unsure what to feel, only that something about justice had changed. And far away, across state lines, a silver-haired woman sat on her porch, staring at the horizon. The mailbox across the street creaked open. Inside was a small package. No return address, only a note. This belonged to your son. He wasn't forgotten. Margaret Thorne stood in her kitchen, the package still unopened on the table. The edges of the cardboard were worn, as if handled with reverence, and the handwriting on the note was unfamiliar, yet unmistakably sincere. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the flap. Inside, wrapped in a piece of weathered canvas, lay Jeremy's dog tag. She hadn't seen it since before he left for deployment. For a moment, everything else faded. The creak of the house, the distant sound of kids playing outside, even the clock, on the wall, frozen in memory. She reached out, picked it up, and held it to her chest. He had come home twice now, once in a flag-draped casket, and now in a silence that meant even more. Colonel Hale's truck rolled down a gravel road, surrounded by pine. In the passenger seat, a stack of old photos, young faces, unit snapshots, a black and white image of a boy no older than 20, Jeremy Thorne, smiling in the middle of a group with arms thrown over each other's shoulders. The background, snow, sandbags, and steel. At a gas station miles away, Hale stopped for diesel. As he stepped out, a young man in uniform caught his eye. Not because of the outfit, but because of the way the young man stood. Alert, but humble, like someone taught discipline without arrogance. Sir, the young man said, offering a nod as they crossed paths. Hale gave a short one back. Where you stationed? Pendleton, infantry. Second deployment starts next month. Hale nodded, then paused. You got someone looking out for you? The young man hesitated. A fiancé. No family left, sir. Hale reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a contact card. If anything ever goes sideways, you reach out to this number. Not for politics, not for favors, just people who care. The young man looked confused, but took it with both hands. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, just make it home. Back in the city, Judge Harding was not in his chamber. He stood instead in front of the local veteran memorial, dressed not in his robe, but in a plain gray coat. He looked older without the robe, like a man whose armor had finally been peeled away. He watched a father help his son place flowers at the foot of a marble name wall. A name on the lower left caught his eye. Jeremy R. Thorne. He stood still. For years, he'd ruled over courtrooms with efficiency, expecting deference, demanding clarity. But what had happened in his own courtroom last week, the way the silence had outweighed his gavel, had unraveled something in him. He thought of Joseph Emory, of the way the man had unpinned his silver star, not in defiance, but in surrender, and of the officer who had stood, firm, calm, immovable, asking permission to speak, not with authority, but with truth. Harding had read the judicial complaint. He had seen his name on headlines. But the thing that weighed the most wasn't the public's outrage. It was the realization that in his quest for control, he had missed the very meaning of justice. That evening, Colonel Hale returned to his apartment. Simple, quiet, no decorations. On the table lay a folder with the names of the men he had served with. Next to it, an invitation, handwritten, inviting him to speak at a local high school on Veterans Day. He almost threw it away. But something made him stop. Instead, he picked it up and placed it gently beside the folder. The silence in the apartment wasn't heavy anymore. It was purposeful. like breath held before a word finally spoken. It began with a grainy cell phone video. No music, no edits. Just a shaky frame from the back of the courtroom capturing the precise moment the man in uniform stood and said, "May I speak, Your Honor?" Within 24 hours, the clip had amassed 2 million views. Veterans shared it in private forums. Military spouses sent it to each other late at night. High school teachers played it in civics classes. The moment wasn't polished, it didn't need to be. It was raw, real, and undeniable. A man had stood for another man, not with anger, but with dignity. And in doing so, he reminded a fractured public of something it had nearly forgotten. Honor doesn't shout. It endures. At a small VFW hall in rural Missouri, the video played on a mounted screen above a bar. Men who rarely spoke during meetings now watched with full attention. One stood slowly, removed his hat and saluted the screen. Not the man, but what he represented. In California, a young woman sat in a university library, headphones on, tears running down her cheeks. Her grandfather's name was engraved on a forgotten monument in Korea. She watched the video 3 times before texting her father, "I get it now." And in a newsroom in D.C., a journalist who had long since stopped believing in anything beyond clicks found herself staring at the paused frame of Joseph Emory's face. She began writing, not for headlines, but for truth. Meanwhile, Joseph Emory himself sat on a wooden bench at Veterans Memorial Park unnoticed. A soft breeze moved the leaves above him. He wore his old blue blazer again. The silver star was not pinned this time. It rested in his hand. Next to him sat Colonel Hale. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, Hale said, "You started something, you know." Joseph didn't look up. Didn't mean to. "I know," Hale said. "That's why it worked." A little boy walked by holding his mother's hand. He stopped, looked at Joseph, then at the medal in his hand. "Is that real?" the boy asked. Joseph smiled slightly. "Yes, son, it is." "Did you win it?" Joseph thought for a moment. "I didn't win anything. I just came home." The boy nodded like he understood, even if he didn't yet. "Thank you," he said. Joseph nodded back, eyes softening. "You're welcome." At the courthouse, Judge Harold Whitmore's office was empty. His nameplate had been removed. The blinds were drawn. A letter sat on the desk, unsigned. It was a resignation that never needed delivery. Public opinion had already written the final verdict. But downstairs, a new sign was being affixed to the wall outside courtroom 3B. It read, "Veterans Observation Room, in honor of Joseph F. Emory." No ceremony. No speech, just a plaque, quiet and enduring. In the weeks that followed, the ripple spread. Podcasts debated the meaning of dignity. Veterans told stories they hadn't told in decades. Young people asked their elders questions they'd never thought to ask. And in a small town, Margaret Thorne stood at her son's grave holding his dog tag. The wind was cool, the sky clear. She looked to the horizon and whispered, "They finally saw you, Jeremy." Not with banners, not with headlines, but with silence. The kind that speaks louder than applause. The kind that lasts. The story had become more than just a courtroom incident. It had become a mirror. Across the country, people weren't just watching. They were responding. Letters began arriving at Joseph Emory's modest home. Not fan mail, but testimonies. Handwritten notes, postcards from veterans, school children, even former judges. Most said the same thing in different words. "Thank you for standing there." Joseph read each one. Not with pride, but with quiet acknowledgement. He never replied. He didn't need to. One morning, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside, a folded piece of paper and a photograph. The image showed 3 young soldiers, beside a helicopter in a jungle clearing, one of them unmistakably young Joseph. On the back, written in block letters, "He saved my life. No one ever knew. Now they do." Joseph stared at the photo for a long time. Then, for the first time in years, he cried. Colonel Hale, now facing an avalanche of speaking invitations, declined them all. Instead, he requested only one thing: a session before Congress's Committee on Veterans Affairs. Not to seek a law, not to call for punishment, but to ask a single question. How did we get so far from gratitude? His testimony wasn't televised live, but clips spread. In one, Hale held up the silver star and said, "This isn't just decoration, it's a promise. And we're the ones breaking it." The room was silent. Even the politicians had nothing to say. In high schools across the Midwest, teachers began adding Joseph's story to their lesson plans, not as history, but as current events that mattered. One student wrote in an essay, "We learn about presidents and battles. But maybe we should learn more about people like Joseph who didn't ask to be remembered, but should be." In Texas, a school named their new library the Emory Room. No one asked Joseph's permission. They just did it. Meanwhile, in a coffee shop in Maryland, a young lawyer sat across from his father, a retired Marine. "You ever see anything like that in court?" he asked, referring to the video still playing on a loop over the counter. "The father shook his head. "Not in court, but I saw that look once in Saigon. A man held his brother's dog tags the same way Joseph held that medal. Not like treasure, like weight." The son nodded slowly, understanding something he never had before. At night, Joseph sat quietly in his armchair. The medal no longer sat. Under glass, it lay on the table beside him as it had during the trial. Not on display, not hidden. Just there. One evening, he turned to Hale and asked, "You think any of this actually changed anything?" Hale answered without hesitation, "No, you did." Joseph shook his head. "I didn't say anything." Hale smiled. "Exactly." In New York, a retired judge wrote a column titled, "The Day Honor Cross-Examined Power." It went viral. In it, he admitted that he too had once dismissed a decorated veteran as irrelevant during a trial. "No one stood for him," the judge wrote. "I didn't see him then, but I see him now." At the bottom of the piece, he included a photo, an old courtroom bench with a single silver star resting on the seat. And in the original courtroom, the plaque outside 3B began gathering small tokens, folded notes, miniature flags, medals pinned with quiet reverence. No one told people to do it. They just came. One note read, "You reminded us that silence is not weakness, it's patience." Another simply said, "We see you now." The world didn't stop spinning. Wars didn't end. Justice wasn't suddenly perfected. But something shifted. In hearts, in minds, in how we looked at the quiet ones among us. Not because Joseph demanded it, but because he never did. The memorial wall stood silently beneath a pale morning sky, dew glistening on its cold granite surface. Joseph Emory, in his navy blue blazer, stood in front of it, unmoving. No crowds, no cameras, just him, the names, and the echo of memory. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver star and held it gently, not as a symbol of glory but of weight, grief, and promise. Behind him, the younger officer, Colonel Hale, stood in quiet guard, not saying a word. He knew this moment wasn't his to speak. Joseph's hand trembled slightly as he pinned the medal back on his chest. But this time, it wasn't for a courtroom. It was for them, for the names carved in stone, for the ones who didn't come home. He whispered, almost too softly to hear, "We carried you with us, every day, and we still do." And then finally, he stepped back. The story didn't end there. Weeks later, a resolution passed in Congress, not just to condemn the treatment of Joseph Emory, but to mandate that all federal courts receive updated training in veteran sensitivity. It wasn't about politics. It was about acknowledgement. Veterans organizations launched a new initiative, the Silent Star Project, sharing stories of unsung heroes who never asked to be honored, but deserved it anyway. Joseph's photo became the quiet icon of the campaign. Not staged, not polished. Just him in that worn blazer, medal on his heart, eyes full of history. Young lawyers began citing the Emory precedent in ethics classes, arguing that dignity must sometimes stand above protocol. Professors called it a turning point in courtroom culture. Even Judge Whitmore's silence carried forward. He never returned to law, never spoke publicly, but his absence became part of the story, how power, unchecked by empathy, can be quietly removed. Joseph, meanwhile, went on living, quietly, exactly how he liked it. He returned to his daily walks, the same diner, the same chair by the window. People recognized him now, nodded respectfully, but never approached. They knew not to turn him into a statue. He was not a moment. He was a man. One day, a small package arrived at his door. No note, just a child's drawing, crayon lines of a courtroom, a man with a medal and stick figures standing in the background. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, "You made me want to be good." Joseph smiled, and for the first time in months, he pinned the drawing next to the window, right beneath the folded flag. Years later, when Joseph Emory passed away, no announcement was made. But word spread as it always had, with whispers. At his funeral, there were no political speeches, no grand ceremonies, just a flag-draped coffin, a few friends, and hundreds of strangers who had never met him, but had felt him. As the honor guard fired their salute, Colonel Hale stepped forward. He placed a small box on the casket. Inside, the silver star. He didn't take it with him, Hale later said, because he already gave it to us. The final legacy of Joseph Emory wasn't about military heroism or courtroom silence. It was about what happens when one man refuses to lower his head in the face of injustice, when dignity doesn't raise its voice, but still echoes for miles. His story reminded a divided country of something deeper than argument, that honor isn't spoken. It's carried. And sometimes, when it's placed beside a microphone, the entire world finally listens. Thank you for watching this story. If it touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember what real courage looks like. Drop a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and above all, never forget the quiet ones. They're the ones who already stood.